Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Metcalf, and I am Chief Research Officer at AWIS and PI for the ARC Network. And I would like to extend a thank you to all of you for registering for this ARC Network webinar. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. So first, you should all know that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be made available to everyone who registered after the event is done. We'll be uploading the recording into the ARC Network online community platform as well. As a short introduction to our web platform for this webinar, which is Zoom, I wanted to point out a couple of useful features for the app, since I know not everyone uses Zoom every day like we do at AWIS. So first, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a couple of different menu options. In the bottom left side of the screen, you can adjust your microphone and video settings, including muting, unmuting, and turning your video on and off. In the bottom middle of the screen, there are menu options for question and answer, chat, raising your hand, and more. We've placed everyone on mute and ask that if you have any questions about Zoom or you experience any technical difficulties, that you please use the chat function, and Aspen, Liz, and I'll help you out. If you have any questions for any of our presenters today, please use the question and answer function. We will address all questions directed to the presenters at the conclusion of the presentation today. Second, I wanted to share a bit about the ARC network as we get started on this webinar on identity-based harassment and a report from the workshop that we hosted in July 2019. As the outline to the webinar, like I said, first I'll introduce the ARC network, then we'll talk about the rationale for and structure of the workshop. Joan will be covering that for us. We'll briefly review the work done by our scholars at the workshop, and we'll provide an overview of 4 major research areas that were prioritized by our workshop participants, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. We have a number of great presenters today. As I mentioned, Joan Herbers, who is the chair of our ARC Research Advisory Board, will be providing some background context on the Emerging Research Workshop, and we'll be introducing each of our panelists. We have Kevin Swartout, Ximena Cid, Danielle Dickens, and Alexandra Tracy-Ramirez, and Joan will shortly here be giving you a little bit more background on each of these great presenters that we have today. First, a little bit about the ARC network. The goal of the ARC network is to create and cultivate broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As a STEM equity brain trust, the ARC network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. The ARC network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization. To learn more about the ARC network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. The ARC network rests on 3 different pillars as we do this work. We aim to do the work through an intersectional, intentional, and inclusive lens. In addition, one of the key segments that we do through this ARC network is, as part of the curation work, is our emerging research workshops. I'm going to pass it over to Joan, who can tell you a little bit more about the emerging research workshop.
Thanks, Heather. Hello to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So an important component of the ARC network is to identify themes for which we need more scholarly research. The Research Advisory Board, which I chair, is charged with identifying a theme every year around which to build a workshop. Our inaugural Emerging Themes workshop focused on identity-based harassment. We had a stellar planning committee that planned the 2-day workshop with the goal of lining out major areas for which additional research is needed. Our workshop participants first agreed upon a common definition of identity-based harassment, which is shown on the next slide. Identity-based harassment includes any denigrating behavior that targets individuals with respect to their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, socioeconomic status, or other social demographic categories. It can cause harm to the individual as well as to others around them. Such behavior can range from verbal slights all the way through to assault and physical violence. It not only undermines the individual and is especially harmful to those with multiple marginalized identity, but it shapes the academic workplace culture, affecting productivity, sense of belonging, employee retention, and so on. Next slide, please. Our workshop participants represented a range of identities themselves, as well as career stages, institution type, and disciplines. Over 2 days, they developed a shared understanding of the task, described the current state of our knowledge, and had a special focus on intersectionality and academic women in STEM. They then did the hard work of determining gaps in our understanding and prioritized emerging areas for future work. Thereafter, we developed a white paper and disseminated it broadly across the community. Feedback from the community was incorporated, and we published the white paper last month. It is available on equityandstem.org, and we encourage you all to take a look at it. That white paper identifies numerous areas for future research and lines out our 4 priorities. We urge you to read the entire report, which can be found on the website below. And please note, we're only able to talk about 4 priority areas today, but there's a laundry list of additional research questions that we hope will interest you. So 4 workshop participants will now describe the emerging workshop themes that were prioritized. Let me first introduce Dr. Kevin Swartout. Dr. Swartout is an associate professor of psychology at Georgia State University, where he runs the lab for violence against women prevention. His research seeks to understand social influences on aggressive behavior, large-scale patterns of sexual violence, and victimization. He will tell you about the first research priority, which is to put gas on the fire. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Swartout.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Heather, for helping to put this webinar together on this very important topic. It's an honor to speak on behalf of the group of scholars and activists and other stakeholders who contributed to this working group. We were a lively bunch, and it was a really enjoyable discussion. And the phrase "putting gas on the fire" might not be entirely self-explanatory. What we meant by that as a group was to really kind of double down or put additional resources on innovative ideas or things that are the most promising in this space of reducing gender-based harassment. And for those reasons, we really discussed our desire to support promising prevention and intervention programming to reduce harassment, but also to not forget about the importance of supporting survivors and having survivors be at the center of all of our discussions, and putting resources forward for response and intervention, and again, supporting those people who are affected by harassment and violence. Because, of course, at the end of the day, that is what we're trying to reduce, and those are the people that we are trying to help. So generally speaking, our group really discussed the true impact of primary prevention research, the literature around the fact that people who have been touched by violence and harassment actually are not negatively impacted by research on violence and harassment, and in fact, in many cases, they appreciate that researchers and different organizations are engaged in trying to address gender-based harassment. So there's often positive outcomes, and just the general need as a group of, again, scientists and practitioners to really divert resources away from programs that historically haven't been showed to be very effective, and really focus more on those innovative and promising approaches that haven't gotten as much attention over the last few decades. So here we've got, kind of just an overview of what I just discussed on how we would move forward. We need a contextual understanding of harassment to understand what the risk and protective factors are for harassment if we hope to prevent it. But also, again, trying to focus in on the victims and survivors who are central to these causes or these issues. So, and again, I kind of really iterated this. This was a big portion of our discussion in terms of really trying to understand how we can approach primary prevention and addressing intervention guidelines and topics while considering the needs of the survivors and having them to be really central to our process. And I think I kind of went through in my overview really kind of the different bullet points of what we have here.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Are there any last words, Kevin? I think you're finished. All right, thanks.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess I kind of lumped everything together, and I wasn't really kind of going with. I just returned from an international trip, so I'm perhaps a little bit jet lagged. I apologize.
You're fine. You're fine. Thank you for that summary. So our second emerging research theme will be described by Dr. Ximena Cid, who is an assistant professor of physics at the California State University-Dominguez Hills. Dr. Cid is very active in the physics education community as well as practicing physics herself, and is dedicated to promoting diversity, equity, inclusion. She identifies primarily as Chicana and Yaqui, and recently was selected as a delegate to the International Conference on Women in Physics. Dr. Cid will describe the second research imperative, which is to value all knowledge production. Dr. Cid.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being a part of this discussion today. Again, I want to thank the organizers, also the participants that spent a few days during the summer to have these discussions. As was mentioned, I consider myself Chicana and indigenous. My tribe is Yaqui. And the reason, and I'm also a physicist, and the reason that they say these things is to kind of give perspective in the lens in which I view diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that relates to physics and the space sciences. I'm a board member of the National Society of Hispanic Physicists. I also work very strongly with the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. And as someone who has multiple identities, depending on what conversations we have, I don't often get to choose what identity is salient for those conversations. And I think part of what we discussed and part of what I valued about this particular workshop and this particular discussions is that we spent a significant amount of time where we were introducing ourselves to each other. Some of us knew each other, some of us didn't. And in a lot of the conversations and workshops that I've led on diversity, equity, inclusion, harassment, biases, microaggressions, macroaggressions, racism, sexism, all of those isms and things, often we don't spend enough time, I think, getting to know each other. And so what I really valued about this group of people is that it created the sense of humanity by really focusing on our connection with each other. And so it also created, by spending that amount of time, it allowed us to understand safe spaces, right? And it was very intentional that we identified the terms, like what does it mean when we talk about diversity? What does it mean when we talk about inclusion? And how does that relate to the spaces that we are a part of? And so by spending that amount of time, we all came with different lenses because we were all part of different fields, but it allowed us to really kind of share our vulnerabilities. And if we don't all have the same starting points, there wasn't really that kind of sense of, well, can I say these things or can I not say these things, or how is it that I'm going to phrase the questions that I have? So I think it was really important to spend that amount of time so that we could have very deep discussions about these issues without, taking things personally or without, having negative feelings. A lot of these issues are very sensitive, and a lot of us from marginalized backgrounds have experienced a significant amount of traumas, right, as we persist in our STEM disciplines. We don't sometimes in the natural sciences, within physics, space sciences, have colleagues that are like us. For instance, I think in some current research that we're working on, we know about 10 indigenous physicists or space sciences in the country. And so the likelihood of having colleagues within our fields is sometimes very low. So the idea of valuing all knowledge and production, part of what we discussed about this, and part of what was also very powerful, is that many of us were coming from different subfields. Often what we discuss in physics, space sciences, or within physics education is that there is a tremendous amount of work being done across disciplines. And when we're in our home disciplines, we often don't know the literature or know the work that's being done within different disciplines. So the idea of inter, trans, and multidisciplinary approaches start to become very important, and who has access to that. So those of us that do this work, often we spend time outside of our disciplines in journals understanding what is being done in psychology, what is being done in sociology, as well as, sometimes even anthropology, social-cultural anthropology. And those give us very, very different perspectives, because they're looking at STEM fields from an outside perspective, whereas some of us from within STEM fields have different experiences, different knowledge sets. So when we talked about valuing all knowledge production, part of that was thinking about how is it that we can get our own disciplines to value work that's being done outside of our field. So if we go to the next slide, some of the questions that we talk about is thinking about academic culture, right? So if we're in our various home disciplines and we're within academia, we have different requirements for what's rewarded. So if you're on the tenure track, how is it that institutions are defining teaching service and research? And that also varies between institutions, right? So if you're at a teaching institution or a two-year college institution, or a PhD granting institution, there are different emphasis on each one of those three reward structures. We also think a lot sometimes about funding, right? So for my field in NSF, NSF specifically focuses on innovative research. And so when we think about reproducing older studies or assessing how generalizable are our findings for best practices or inclusion, part of what is restricting for us is the funding agencies or the reward structures between our institutions. So if we're on the tenure track, right, and we're not quite tenure, we do have to cater to what our institutional needs are or what our institutional demands are. Sometimes our institutions are very supportive of what counts as research, but other times you kind of have to play this game of how am I going to be productive within these systems? And so when we talked about valuing all knowledge production, we were really thinking about how is it that our fields are driving the work that's being done? How is it that our fields are also restricting the work that's being done? Sometimes it also comes down to thinking about who does the work. So in the previous slide, we were talking about marginalized communities within marginalized disciplines. So if you are, for instance, PER, sometimes you're looked at as maybe separate from an actual physicist. So we have to then reprove what are our qualifications. And so how does that then impact and come back to this idea of identity-based harassment? Because in some cases, it's not necessarily like personal identity, but field identity. And so all of these things start to influence each other. And they kind of create these tensions and create these conflicts. So if we go to the next slide, part of what we also were discussing is when we do have knowledge that's being generated by interdisciplinary scholars, how is it that we uplift that then? And how is it that we acknowledge that? So a lot of the conversations within the physics communities, national societies, national conferences, we really are trying to think about how is it that we can push back a little bit to create more broad understanding. So this is thinking about funding agencies. How is it that we can fund studies that are reassessing, best practices? Often we have a study that was done in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we continue to cite these without acknowledging that a lot of change has happened since those times. So part of, when we think about the valuing all knowledge, it's not just across disciplines, but also thinking about who gets to decide what that knowledge is, who gets to decide what the value of that knowledge is. When we think about science, how do we define science, and how is it that we are being inclusive in those discussions? So I thought that at least participating in these conversations, by connecting with scholars in different subfields, we were able to share our resources. Part of what we discussed and part of what kind of came out of the white paper and what these reports are talking about is our abilities to cite each other, to have greater access to journals that do have very strong publications within sociology, psychology, natural sciences, anthropology, and also to how is it that we can devote our resources to expanding what our own knowledge bases are. So I think that having all of us there were people from different levels, there were people from professional societies that were giving various insight, various perspectives. It allowed us to kind of recenter ourselves and then start to think about what is the work that I do and how can I think broader. And then also spending time where we could actually talk about these really deep questions without it being just surface level. That we have the ability to connect with each other and share our knowledge, but then to really think deeply about the challenges within our fields and how is it that we can take this knowledge back and reassess the ways that we are approaching our own research, our own teaching, our own service. So I really appreciated being a part of this conversation. I thought it was very different than some of the other conversations that I've been a part of because we had that amount of time dedicated to getting to know each other and bringing in
Thanks very much, Ximena. That was a wonderful description of the complexity of the issues that we tried to tackle over 2 days. Mm-hmm. So our third priority value will be presented by Dr. Danielle Dickens. Dr. Dickens is an assistant professor of psychology at Spelman College, where she uses an interdisciplinary approach to understand the social construction and intersection of identities, and especially how they affect health behaviors, academic performance, and psychological well-being. She will spotlight our third priority. She will present our third priority, spotlight research on STEM women of color in minority-serving institutions. Dr. Dickens.
Yes, thank you once again for putting on this webinar, and thank you for all of you all who have decided to join us today. And I echo the sentiments so far of the other presenters in terms of just how much I thoroughly enjoyed attending the workshop. And for me, it was one of the few conferences, workshops that I attended that had a social justice focus, that we went in and that not only that we were discussing about these issues, but trying to figure out different strategies in order to combat these types of intersectionality-based harassments that were happening at the different institutions that included a mixture of both faculty, staff, and practitioners. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it as well. So I wanted to talk about or spotlight the unique experiences that are happening at institutions, particularly minority-serving institutions. And so oftentimes when we're thinking about knowledge production, there may be this assumption or focus on research-intensive, predominantly white institutions. And so when we mean by minority-serving institutions, so that includes a range of institutions, such as Hispanic-serving institutions, historically black colleges and universities, women's institutions, males institutions, and tribal colleges and institutions as well. And these institutions are very unique, and each of them have their own set of values and traditions and cultures that make them unique in and of itself. And so for me, being a part of the workshop and others there understood the importance of focusing on the unique experiences, particularly of women of color, staff, students, and faculty members that are at these different types of minority-serving institutions. Because once again, a lot of the research that we know out there about different types of identity-based harassment, particularly within STEM, comes from the literature, particularly focuses on these individuals at research-intensive universities. But thinking about most of the, or many of the minority-serving institutions, though some of them are larger institutions, many of them are can be small colleges. And so thinking about at a small college institution, how this type of identity-based harassment may look and how it would impact different faculty, staff, or students. And so this is an important aspect to look at, particularly among women of color, to really get at the intersectional experiences that may be happening. Right? So for instance, if you are a woman of color at a historically Black college or university, where there may be this assumption that there is this shared experience, or that most of the faculty members may be representative of the students. And even, for instance, at my college, at Spelman College, some departments is still reflective of what it may be like at predominantly white institutions in terms of the faculty, where certain departments such as physics or chemistry, some of the departments, it may not still be representative of the student body population. And so in this particular area, we wanted to focus on a couple of questions that get at the uniqueness of the context of minority serving institutions and how that can have an impact on particularly women of color due to the double marginalization of being discriminated against or marginalized due to their race and their gender. So one wants to look at particularly what are the unique experiences of women of color in STEM at these various minority serving institutions. And particularly thinking about what are some of the maybe shared experiences that they may have, and what are some of the unique experiences relative to women of color at, for instance, predominantly white institutions. And then also thinking about the importance of focusing on and think about what do we consider to be the science fields? Because oftentimes a lot of the research may focus on particular types of what we may call the natural sciences or hard sciences, but being more expansive to explore what are some of these unique experiences, particularly among women of color in STEM, in, for instance, psychology or sociology or political science, some of the social sciences as well. So that was a topic that came up for us. And then also, in terms of thinking about most of these institutions, of course, no institution is perfect, but they do have an established record of providing inclusion and support for their students, faculty, and staff. And so thinking about focusing in on what are some of the unique cultural contexts or experiences that or policies that these institutions provide. To see that particularly, how do they create a space or a sense of belonging for the faculty and the students, and to particularly doing a mixed methods approach of doing both qualitative and quantitative approaches to explore some of the unique policies and practices that may be taking place at these minority serving institutions. And so, another thing that I think was important that came up is to highlight the research that's already happening at these type of institutions. I think oftentimes there is that assumption that research is only taking place at these big research intensive universities, but at a lot of groundbreaking research on social justice and STEM and the intersectional experiences of individuals in STEM is happening at minority serving institutions. So I think it's important that we also focus in on and highlight some of the research that is being conducted at these types of institutions. And also, so some of those, I mentioned it, but additional recommendations, once again, to think about STEM more broadly, and also to look at some of the differences among disciplines, particularly, as was mentioned before, just a few numbers of women of color in certain fields, especially when we think about physics. There's still fewer women of color. If we think about graduate students, even women of color that reach the faculty level. So really focusing on what's happening in these certain disciplines while there's very few women of color, particularly at the faculty level. And then once again, to make sure that the research is more broadly to include an intersectional approach, thinking once again and focusing on the type of institution as well.
Thanks very much for that comprehensive review, Danielle. So our fourth and final priority area will be presented by Ms. Alexandra Tracy-Ramirez. Ms. Tracy-Ramirez is an attorney working in Arizona who has extensive experience in higher education law. Her practice focuses on defamation, invasion of privacy, and Title IX litigation. She will present our final priority, which is to shift the focus from institutional liability to harm mitigation. Go ahead, Alexandra.
Thank you. Just as a technical, can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you everybody for participating in the workshop. I had such a great time getting to meet everyone. And it was one of those rare events where we had a really fabulous time, but also were extremely productive, not just in the meeting, but moving forward. So thank you to the organizers and all of you on the ARC network for helping keep the momentum going for those of us who participated, and not letting us just get swept back up into our busy lives and never really come back to all of these things. As Joan had mentioned, I'm sort of a unique in the room person at the workshop because I'm an attorney. I'm not in academia. I used to be an investigator at 2 different universities, one in Arizona and one in Colorado, where my job was to investigate on behalf of the institution reports of harassment or discrimination. And for the past 5 years, I have been suing universities and schools who've been not doing the right thing, which is much more rewarding for me and for my clients, I think. But it's given me some perspectives on how these conversations happen. We know that we're always going to be dealing with laws and policies that govern the way that institutions respond to reports of harassment and discrimination, and maybe approach how they prevent concerns. And if our group's conversation could be summarized as a directive, I think it would be, don't aim for the floor, aim for something higher. When we talk about compliance, we're unfortunately, a lot of institutions, their conversations are happening with their high-level administrators and attorneys, and it's focused on risk reduction to the institution. What kinds of things do we have to do so that we don't get sued, so that we don't get in trouble? And what we would like to do from our group is help institutions, encourage them to aim for something higher, to aim to reduce the harm that these processes cause, because nobody's happy with them. So for those of you who have been following the Department of Education's kind of trajectory on modifying Title IX, which is one of the key anti-discrimination laws affecting universities and education programs. You know, back in, I think it was it 2018 is when the Department of Education announced that they were going to be putting forward some serious changes to the way that the regulations are for Title IX. And there were, I'm trying to look at my notes real quick, 124,000 comments, public comments on Title IX during the response period. And some of those comments were from people who've experienced harassment, some were from people who've been accused of harassment and misconduct, from practitioners, from activists, from a variety of different groups. And although they all had very different perspectives, the common theme that emerged is that everyone's unhappy with how colleges and institutions enforce Title IX anti-discrimination policies and practices. Nobody thinks that they're fair. Nobody thinks that they're helpful, and nobody trusts them. So what we wanted to really focus on is drawing from, you know, the kinds of research and work that's being done in other contexts to pull some of that in, recognizing that of course we have to be mindful about the laws and policies, but broadening the conversation to include the expertise of people who have experienced harassment and discrimination, the expertise of people who are researching these issues across STEM disciplines, and also rely on the research and expertise of people in other disciplines as well, so that we can focus on reducing the harm that the processes themselves create, instead of just focusing on reducing harm or reducing liability for the institution. Because an unfortunate reality that was echoed by a number of participants in the workshop as well as a majority of my clients, is that when an institution mishandles a report of harassment or discrimination, that feels often like it is a greater violation and a greater trauma than the experience that led a person to report the harassment or discrimination in the first place. And that is really unfortunate. And it's our hope that we can encourage some better conversations to have legal counsel or the administrators who are doing this work broaden where they're getting their information from and listen to a wider range of voices. It's not that these voices are not loud, and it's not that they're not talking. It's that certain folks aren't listening, and we'd really like them to. And that's sort of the focus that we were having. And the harm reduction concept is something that came out of the 80s, really thinking about the public health crisis to do with the spread of HIV and the way that folks who were testing positive or were suspected to be positive were being treated. And since that time, the principles behind it of really meeting people where they are, of understanding the unique experiences of the people who are being harmed, and really trying to center those experiences and make some practical interventions and practical suggestions. Those are really the principles that we'd like to see brought into the way that institutions are dealing with harassment and discrimination. So not just compliance for the sake of compliance, but can institutions recenter the conversation? Yes, achieve compliance, but also, do a whole lot more. So, one of the things we talked about from my experience and research comes from the way that medical malpractice cases have been handled. So a lot of states now have what are called apology laws, where when someone messes up and they do something wrong and they actually apologize and they're sincere about it, that can't be used against them in any sort of legal case. And it was meant to try to encourage people to remember to be humans and to say that you're sorry when you mess up and to really mean it and to try to do better. And that's the kind of principle that we'd love to see happen, not just thinking about, cases where principles of restorative justice can be incorporated into, for example, the sanctions that someone might face if they've engaged in harassment or discrimination, but really the way that universities and institutions themselves need to make amends for how they have mishandled cases or how they continue to do that, right? Remembering to be people and not just, focusing on how do we avoid a lawsuit, but really thinking about what is the right thing to do? How do we know, and how can we do that? So we want folks to do the right thing for the right reasons and not only focus on compliance, because it's not particularly effective. And there's a lot of research on that. But there's also research from a variety of places thinking about how we can bring these principles in to address different kinds of contexts within academia. So again, university hospitals are one. Thinking about student conduct, student affairs areas are places where different institutions have really tried to bring in the practices of restorative justice that are have been used for a very long time outside academia, particularly in communities of color, to think holistically about what harm is and how harm needs to be addressed. So our group had folks who have been experiencing harassment and discrimination, who are involved in the administration, dealing with policies and practices and wanting to do better. And it's been our experience that often the people who are doing this work, who are making policies and procedures, are underfunded, underappreciated, overworked, and really could use some help in understanding what the right thing to do is. So that was really our focus and guiding our research questions about how do we bring these kinds of concepts in? What kind of partnerships do we need? Because it really needs to be collaborative across a variety of disciplines. Again, going back to some of the other participants and the areas of research, we really want to make sure that we are listening to the people who are talking. This isn't a new concept that we came up with in our 2-day workshop, but really just trying to think about how all of the amazing work that folks are doing across different disciplines might be used in some new ways to help make the way that institutions handle these issues a little less compliance-based and a little bit more human.
Thank you, Alex. That was a really great recap. I was part of your group, and I just myself was so jazzed to think about this new way of treating issues of identity-based harassment. So thank you for that. Thank you to all our presenters for presenting the results of complex issues in a digestible form. We'd now like to encourage our audience to ask questions, make comments. If you want to direct them to a particular panelist, that's fine. Or if you just want to have an open-ended question for the group to chew on, that's fine as well. And Heather Metcalf is going to moderate and facilitate the Q&A session. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. It looks like we already have a couple of questions in through our chat boxes. So one of our participants extends a thank you to all presenters and has a couple of questions. She says, as a minority scholar who experienced extreme sexual harassment during her research fieldwork, she'd like to ask a question regarding the inclusivity of aid for victims. That is, as a victim when seeking help, she was constantly told, sorry, we only service geologists. Sorry, we only help undergraduates. Sorry, you aren't eligible because the harassment occurred off campus, etc. She's curious how already marginalized students can find the support they need given the fixed parameters of organizations that exist to help victims and the limitations they have. Also, the ways in which this impasse creates a situation where you must make waves or feel like you're being the problem student when you're a minority scholar who's already excluded from access and funds, when you have to advocate for yourself as a victim of harassment.
So one thing that was raised, I don't know if this was directed at anybody in particular, but one thing that was raised in this conversation was the need for training. So if there are concerns that are being raised and they're addressing to a specific office or to a specific person, what kind of training has that person done to actually work with victims or survivors, depending on at what stage this is. I don't know if there's an answer, if any of us had discussed an actual answer to this, but it was very, it was stressed in quite a few conversations about the need to train people, whether that's faculty, because we often get students that are coming into our offices, or whether that's the counseling services on our offices, Title IX offices, ombudsman offices. Like who are the people that are getting these complaints or these comments, and thinking about how is it that we can kind of create a more holistic way of thinking about our services with the training that is provided by our institutions. I'm not sure if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, let me jump in here. This is Joan again. We did have a representative from a professional society, and one of the questions that was very interesting to a lot of people was how can professional societies work with academic institutions to help bridge some of these gaps. So you'll see in the white paper that there's some issues, some discussion around that. And there was a lot of interest in seeing what kinds of partnerships we might be able to forge there.
Danielle, did you have something? I didn't want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, just to add to what was already said, I think that, one thing that may be helpful in addition to the training is to become knowledgeable about the different policies and practices and supports that's on one's campus, and You know, for instance, for me, being at Spelman, and one of the courses I teach is psychology of women. And so there's a chapter that we talk about gender-based violence. And so I have, you know, someone from the Title IX office come to talk to the students. And just that, and it's only for a 50-minute class, but a lot of the, you know, students weren't aware of some of the resources that were available to them on campus. So I think that maybe could be something that can be helpful in just terms of just, you know, for one, for individuals just become a little bit more knowledgeable about the different resources and who to go to for certain things that may be available to them on campus.
And if we still have a moment, I just want to validate for the person who's asking the question that I think that you're right, that the burdens fall very disproportionately on the people who have been the victims and the targets of harassment and discrimination to be their own advocates, to be the ones who have to run around and try to find which office in which circumstance will serve me and my needs and what I need. And that is incredibly unfortunate and incredibly common. And I don't think any of us has a simple solution, because some resources are limited intentionally by the populations that they are able to serve. Some folks are limited by budgets and other constraints. One of the things that our research question group wanted to address in pushing people, institutions to not just focus on compliance is to encourage them to take on cases to address reports, even if it doesn't rise to the level of a legal complaint of harassment or discrimination. So one of the things that the new proposed regulations on Title IX would do is potentially allow schools to say, no, this didn't happen within the geographical confines of my campus, therefore we don't have to look at it. And from a compliance only perspective, sure, you don't have to do it. But again, what is the right thing? The right thing is you have a student or a faculty member or a staff member who's being affected and we want to help. We should be able to help. And so really trying to get folks to be involved and take on matters that maybe they don't have the legal requirement to do, but it's the right thing to do. And that's what we want to see more of. So I'm very sorry that this has been a situation that our questioner has experienced. And I think it's such a touchstone of all of the different kinds of conversations that our group had is how do we encourage schools to work within the limitations that they have, but also to be really mindful of how they can do more good and less harm.
Thanks, everyone. Kevin, did you want to add anything to this question?
Thanks. I think it's a really important question. This is something that comes up all the time, honestly, on college campuses specifically, whether it's between professional organizations and campuses, or between campus security or the campus in general and local police, if it's something that rises to the occasion of a criminal offense. I would just kind of echo what the other panelists said, and I'm hopeful that organizations and campuses and law enforcement, if it's applicable, will continue to kind of break down these artificial boundaries and start working together better to make sure that, yes, sometimes there are certain entities, and depending on if something calls for response for the survivor, some kind of a investigation process in terms of the offense or whatever it might be, that instead of just kind of simply saying, you know, not our problem, you know, go talk to someone else, that there will be kind of a liaison process to help the person who's brave enough to come forward to find the appropriate avenue to get the resources they need or to facilitate the investigation that needs to take place.
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful responses. We have another question that's directed at Alex. In addition to working on harm reduction approaches, it would be extremely helpful to bring this to law firms who provide legal counsel to scientific societies. There have been several examples of situations that have been made worse as a result of legal advice aimed at protecting the society. Was there any discussion of this at the workshop?
Sorry, my mute button was stuck. We addressed the idea of sometimes lawyers give really bad advice. And it's something that we've heard over and over again as folks who participated in the workshop, and something I can speak to from what my clients have told me is that they have repeatedly been told, well, this is what our lawyers told us to do, or this is what general counsel said. This is what we are allowed to do. Here's what we're not allowed to do. And unfortunately, a lot of lawyers are generalists, and lawyers who are giving advice to professional societies may not be informed by the most relevant and most recent research coming from organizations like this, coming from the work that folks like the ARC Network are doing, that really should be informing not just what does this particular law say, but again, what is a best practice? And so we did, I had a really great conversation, a couple of our groups did, with folks who were there from the professional societies about how do we bring this information together? How do we collaborate so that the rule makers, the people who are at the institutions deciding what the law and policy compliance metrics should look like, really take into account all of this amazing work that other folks are doing in shaping what actually is a better practice, what is the best practice, and how do we enact that here?
Thank you. Another question that we have says that the workshop was focused on research, yet Dr. Dickens' topic is related to policy and institutional change. Did participants discuss how to raise the profile of identity-based harassment in the community broadly? I ask as a physicist, noting that the American Institute of Physics Team-Up report recommended that professional societies establish a coalition similar to the Societies Consortium on Sexual Harassment in STEM to address identity-based harassment beyond sexual harassment. The NASM report has made a big impact on campus, so how about this? I can add something on this. So that part of the reason why we chose identity-based harassment from the research board, we had a lot of discussions. Joan, you might want to add to this too. Why identity-based harassment versus sexual harassment? Because a key pillar of the work that we do is around intersectionality. And we know that a lot of harassment policy and harassment research and harassment-based support programs tend to focus on a single component of harassment or discrimination, whether that's gender or race or sexuality, and tends to center around individual protected classes of identity. And we know that, and one of our presenters, Ximena, just mentioned this earlier, that, you know, in a particular situation, it's really hard to tease out which component of your identity is the piece that's being involved in the situation at hand. So asking a person who's experienced harassment to kind of pigeonhole the component of harassment into whether it happened based on gender or race or sexuality or something else, and if it's about gender, go in this direction, and if it's about race, go over here and see this person, it really doesn't treat these kinds of experiences holistically and respond in a way that supports the whole person and dealing with the experience that they've had. So that's some background information and why we chose this as the topic rather than just honing in on sexual harassment. Joan, did you want to add anything to that before we pass it over to the panelists to comment on this?
I would say you nailed the concept, Heather.
Any of our panelists care to comment on this idea?
Yeah, so I want to, first of all, thank the person that raised the American Institute of Physics Team-Up report. They did a phenomenal job with that report. But, you know, speaking on behalf of some of our physics societies, this question has been coming up a lot on what are the roles of professional societies when there are issues or circumstances of any kind of harassment. And in particular, when we have national conferences, what are the levels of protection that the society is responsible for? So within American Association of Physics Teachers, we've had members that have been harassed off conference grounds or outside of the convention centers. We've had members that are detained, depending on which states that we're a part of, what kind of stereotypes are being raised. And so we've been having a lot of discussions within various committees within our professional societies on trying to understand how is it that we can better address the responsibilities of professional societies for the membership when we are in these national spaces, because we don't necessarily have the same types of protections that we see within our home campuses. So within the American Association of Physics Teachers, we've also had joint conferences between the National Society of Hispanic Physicists or the National Society of Black Physicists, where we are raising issues about ethnic and racial identities as they relate to physics, and how is it that we can use the professional societies to leverage protection within the physics community. We've also had discussions for the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science along the same lines. How is it that when we host national conferences that also end up having discriminatory laws, how is it that we address and protect our membership in those environments? So when we do have national conferences, often they're booked a year, year and a half, 2 years in advance, and then a law will pass. For instance, in Texas, there was the racial profiling law that was passed after the national conference was decided to be held there. And it was against, this idea of immigrants, right? So how is it that then we think about the responsibilities of national societies? I think the good thing about having these national reports and dedication to thinking about various communities that then go out to all physics departments is very powerful. Often we think about what drives the work that's being done in physics society. We have these conversations in national conferences. And so we've also had conversations where we're thinking about the roles that funding agencies have or journal editors have in pushing research and funded research where we really specifically are addressing discriminatory behaviors or harassment issues, and how is that then thought about within our home discipline. So if we're thinking about identity-based harassment that we're publishing outside of our national journals, how does it then that get fed back into our home societies? And so different editors are also now starting to target specific topics. And within our national societies, we're talking with program officers for funding agencies as well. So I really appreciate that question being raised and the reports that are being generated, because it does have a very strong influence on at least the physics community.
Mm-hmm. Any other panelists care to respond to the question?
Like just that one thing, I agree with everything that was said, and I think that there is a lot of ownership on these professional organizations to step up and do more. And more recently, I attended a conference, a psychological conference, this for Society for Social Issues in Psychology. And one of the things that they did at this conference was a couple of years ago, and it was in, I think it was Philadelphia. And so they had a section of the conference where they opened it up to the public. And so I think that was a start in terms of, oftentimes, of course, when we are, especially attending these research conferences, it is just geared towards, or speaking just to other researchers. And so this is a way to open it up to allow community members to learn about the research that we are doing. So I think that that's one way that I think that more organizations can at least share these findings and research that we're conducting on, particularly as it relates to the identity-based harassment.
Thank you, Danielle. Anyone else with last comments before we close out the webinar? No? All right. Well, thank you all of our panelists for joining us and sharing your expertise on these topics and for contributing to the workshop and to the report. And thank you all for attending to learn more about this. And if you have any other follow-up questions that you want to reach out about, you can reach us at equityandstem.org. And we'll be happy to share your questions with the appropriate person who participated today and respond in kind. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.